Life is a series of familiar routines until one unexpected moment changes everything. John Carter, a 70-year-old man, lived a peaceful life with his family, cherishing the small joys of each day. But one ordinary morning turned into the day that changed everything. One moment, one stroke, and suddenly everything he once knew, everything he once loved, felt out of reach. But is this the end of his story, or just the beginning of the greatest fight of his life? This is a story of perseverance, love, and an extraordinary journey that not everyone has the strength to take. Stay with us until the end, because somewhere in this story, you may just find a part of yourself. Before we begin, if you enjoy inspiring and powerful stories like this, make sure to hit subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And if this story moves you, give it a like and share it with others who might need a little inspiration today. This story is for inspirational purposes only. While it includes medical knowledge based on research and treatment protocols, it should not be taken as official medical advice. Always consult a healthcare professional for medical guidance. Rising Again, a 70-year-old's journey to overcoming stroke. Life before the storm. John Carter had always believed in the power of routine. At 70 years old, his life was a delicate balance of tranquility and quiet excitement, a well-worn rhythm that provided him with a sense of purpose. Every morning, like clockwork, he would rise at dawn, lace up his walking shoes, and stroll through the tree-lined streets of his suburban neighborhood. The world was different at that hour, serene, untouched by the day's chaos. He liked it that way. His mornings always began with a slow walk around the neighborhood, where he would wave to familiar faces, Mrs. Thompson, who never missed her early gardening, and Mr. Reynolds, who read his newspaper on the porch with his dog, Buddy, always at his feet. The short walk was followed by a stop at his favorite cafe, a cozy, family-run place where the scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries lingered in the air. He would sit by the window, sip his coffee black, and immerse himself in the local newspaper, sometimes getting into friendly debates with fellow retirees about politics or history. John had been a history professor for over 40 years, and though he had retired, his love for knowledge never waned. His home was a testament to his passion, shelves overflowing with books on everything from ancient civilizations to modern political movements. Even in retirement, he kept his mind sharp by reading voraciously, watching documentaries, and discussing world events with his friends. But beyond his intellectual pursuits, John found his greatest joy in his family. His wife, Margaret, was his rock, his steady companion through 50 years of marriage. Their love had deepened over the decades, growing stronger with each challenge they had faced together. Their daughter, Emily, and their grandchildren were the light of their lives. Every Sunday, their house would be filled with laughter and the aroma of home-cooked meals as the family gathered for dinner, sharing stories and memories. On one particular Sunday, as he sat at the head of the dining table, John couldn't help but feel a sense of deep contentment. The chatter of his grandchildren, the warm hand of Margaret resting over his, the rich smell of roast chicken filling the air. This was happiness. He had worked hard all his life, built a home filled with love, and reached an age where he could enjoy the fruits of his labor. Yet even in this seemingly perfect routine, there were small, almost imperceptible signs that something was amiss. In the past few weeks, John had felt more fatigued than usual. His morning walks, once effortless, had begun to feel slightly arduous. There were fleeting moments of dizziness, which he brushed off as nothing more than dehydration or age catching up with him. He even found himself forgetting minor details, misplacing his glasses, struggling to recall a familiar name in conversation. But he never dwelled on these moments. After all, he was 70. A little forgetfulness was normal, wasn't it? Margaret, however, had noticed. She always did. "John, you seem a little tired lately," she remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I'm fine, Maggie," he assured her with a gentle smile, squeezing her hand. "Just a little worn out. Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix." But Margaret wasn't convinced. She had spent her entire life reading John like an open book, and something about his demeanor unsettled her. One evening, as John was watching a documentary, he reached for his glass of water, and to his surprise, his fingers fumbled. The glass tipped over, spilling water across the coffee table. Margaret rushed to clean it up, but she couldn't ignore the way John flexed his fingers afterward, as if they had betrayed him. "John," she said cautiously, "are you sure everything's all right?" "Just clumsy," he chuckled, brushing it off. Still, the unease lingered. Margaret knew her husband was a proud man, one who disliked admitting weakness. But deep down, she worried that something more serious was at play. She resolved to keep a closer eye on him. The next morning, John went about his routine as usual. He rose early, dressed, and stepped out into the cool morning air for his walk. But as he reached the end of the street, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He paused, gripping a nearby fence for support. The moment passed quickly, and he shook it off, attributing it to standing up too fast. He continued on, stopping by the cafe as always. When he reached for his coffee, his fingers trembled slightly. He quickly steadied his hand, hoping no one had noticed. But inside, an unfamiliar feeling gnawed at him, an inkling that something wasn't right. That evening, as he sat in his study, Margaret entered with a cup of tea, her expression one of quiet concern. "I think you should see the doctor," she said softly. John sighed, setting his book down. "Margaret, I appreciate the concern, but I feel fine." She sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Humor me then, just get checked. For me." He looked into her eyes. The same eyes that had seen him through life's highs and lows. He knew that when Margaret set her mind to something, there was no arguing with her. "All right," he relented, squeezing her hand. "I'll make an appointment." But deep down, he still believed he had nothing to worry about. Little did he know the storm was already brewing, the day that changed everything. The morning began like any other. The sky was a soft shade of blue, the air crisp with the lingering chill of dawn. John Carter woke to the familiar sound of birds chirping outside his bedroom window. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his joints, but that was nothing new. Just another day in the life of a 70-year-old man, he thought with a small chuckle. Margaret was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared their usual breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the house, a comforting aroma that John had come to associate with the start of a good day. "Morning, Maggie," he said as he entered the kitchen, pressing a kiss to her cheek before settling into his chair. "Morning, dear," she replied with a warm smile. "I made your coffee just the way you like it." John reached for the cup, but as his fingers wrapped around the handle, something felt off. His grip faltered, and before he could react, the cup slipped from his grasp, shattering onto the floor. The sound echoed through the kitchen, followed by an eerie silence. Margaret turned sharply, her eyes wide with concern. "John, I don't know what happened," he muttered, staring at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. His fingers tingled, a strange numbness creeping up his arm. Margaret's face paled. "John, squeeze my hand," he tried, but his fingers barely responded. A flicker of panic crossed his face as he struggled to make a fist. His breathing quickened. "John, look at me," Margaret said, her voice now edged with urgency. "Can you raise your right arm?" John frowned, willing his arm to move. It lifted, but not with the ease he was used to. It felt heavy, sluggish. His mind raced, grasping for an explanation. Was it fatigue? A pinched nerve? But then, as he tried to speak, the words tangled in his mouth. Margaret saw it immediately. The slight droop on the right side of his face, The garbled speech, the realization hit her like a freight train. "John, I think you're having a stroke." He tried to protest, to tell her she was overreacting, but the words came out all wrong. He could see the fear in her eyes, but she didn't waste a second. "I'm calling 911, John wanted to argue, to tell her to give him a minute, but deep down, something in him knew she was right. He felt strange, like his body was betraying him, slipping away from his control. His mind remained sharp, yet his limbs refused to obey. It was a terrifying feeling. Margaret's voice trembled as she spoke to the dispatcher. "My husband, he's 70 years old. He just lost grip of his coffee cup. His right side is weak and he's slurring his words. I think he's having a stroke." The operator's voice was calm but firm. "Stay on the line. Help is on the way." Margaret knelt beside John, gripping his left hand tightly. "Just hold on, John. Help is coming." John wanted to reassure her, to tell her he'd be fine, but all he could do was squeeze her hand and hope she understood. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. Paramedics burst through the door, their movements swift and precise. One of them knelt beside John, assessing his condition, while another took Margaret's hand, asking her questions about the onset of symptoms. "He was fine when he woke up," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "It happened so suddenly he dropped his coffee cup and then his arm went weak. He's slurring his words. It's only been about 10 minutes. The paramedics exchanged a look. "That's good. We're within the treatment window." They quickly loaded John onto a stretcher, securing him with practiced efficiency. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, John caught Margaret's gaze. "I'll be right behind you," she promised. The ride to the hospital was a blur. The paramedics worked quickly, checking his vital signs, administering oxygen, and monitoring his neurological responses. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, spoke to him in a reassuring tone. "Mr. Carter, we're taking you to St. Vincent's. They have a specialized stroke unit. We need to act fast, but you're in good hands." John could only nod weakly. His mind raced with questions. What was happening inside his brain? Would he recover? Would he ever be the same again? When they arrived at the emergency room, a team of doctors and nurses was already waiting. John was rushed into a flurry of activity. IV lines, blood tests, rapid imaging. A CT scan was ordered immediately. The doctors needed to determine whether the stroke was caused by a clot or bleeding in the brain. Margaret arrived moments later, breathless and pale, clutching her purse as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. She was ushered into a waiting area while the doctors worked. The minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Finally, a doctor approached her. He was middle-aged, with sharp but kind eyes. "Mrs. Carter," she stood quickly. Is he okay?" "He's stable," the doctor assured her. "We've confirmed that it's an ischemic stroke, meaning a clot is blocking blood flow to his brain. The good news is that you recognized the signs early and called 911 immediately. Because of that, we're able to administer a clot-busting drug called TPA, but we need to act fast." Margaret nodded, blinking back tears. "Will he recover?" The doctor's expression softened. "It's too soon to say. Every stroke is different, and recovery depends on many factors: how quickly treatment was given, which part of the brain was affected. But early intervention gives us the best chance." Margaret swallowed hard. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded. For a moment. When she entered the room, John lay on the hospital bed, IV lines snaking from his arm. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of her footsteps. He looked so vulnerable, so unlike the strong, stubborn man she had always known. She took his hand. "You're going to be okay, John." He tried to respond, but the words came out garbled. A tear slipped down Margaret's cheek, but she forced a smile. "I'm here. We're going to get through this." John squeezed her hand weakly, his eyes filled with a silent promise. He would fight. He had to. For her. For their family. And so, the longest battle of his life began. The fight for survival. John Carter had always been a fighter. Throughout his life, he had faced hardships with grit and resilience, never allowing himself to be beaten down by adversity. But as he lay in the hospital bed, struggling to move, his arm struggling to form words, he felt powerless in a way he had never experienced before. His body was betraying him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The hum of medical machines surrounded him, a constant reminder of where he was. The beeping of the heart monitor, the quiet hum of the IV drip, the distant murmur of voices outside his room, it all blended into a surreal haze. He wanted to sit up, to talk, to ask questions, but his body felt heavy, unresponsive. Margaret was at his side, her hand tightly wrapped around his. She hadn't let go since she had been allowed into the room. He could see the worry in her eyes, the forced smile she gave him whenever he caught her staring. She was trying to be strong for him, but he knew the fear was eating away at her. Doctor entered the room, followed by a nurse holding a clipboard. The doctor was middle-aged, with sharp eyes that spoke of experience. He introduced himself as Dr. Patel, the lead neurologist, overseeing John's case. "Mr. Carter," he said gently, "I know this is a lot to process, but you're in good hands. We've given you TPA, a clot-busting drug, to restore blood flow into your brain. The next 24 hours are critical in determining how much function you'll regain." John tried to speak, but his words came out garbled, incoherent. Frustration burned in his chest. Dr. Patel nodded in understanding. "It's okay. Your speech has been affected, but with therapy, there's a good chance it will improve." John clenched his left hand, the only part of him that seemed to respond properly. He hated feeling like this. Weak, helpless. Margaret squeezed his hand. "We'll get through this, John," Dr. Patel continued. "We need to monitor you closely. There's a risk of another stroke in the coming days, but we'll do everything we can to prevent that. Right now, just rest." The doctor left, and the nurse adjusted his IV drip before stepping out. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. John closed his eyes, exhausted. He wasn't sure how long he had drifted in and out of sleep before he heard a soft knock at the door. A young woman entered, carrying a clipboard and wearing a warm smile. "Hello, Mr. Carter. I'm Emily, your speech therapist." John furrowed his brow. "Already? I know this is sudden, but the sooner we start working on your speech, the better your chances of recovery." She pulled up a chair beside his bed and held up a series of picture cards. "I want you to try saying these words. After me." She pointed to a picture of a cat. "Cat." John opened his mouth, but the sound that came out wasn't a word. It was a jumbled mess of syllables. He exhaled sharply, frustration surging through him. Margaret placed a comforting hand on his arm. "It's okay, John. We'll keep trying." Emily nodded encouragingly. "This will take time, but you're already ahead by just trying. Let's try again." They worked for 20 minutes, and by the end of the session, John had managed to make a few coherent sounds. Though forming full words was still a struggle. "Small progress is still progress," Emily reassured him before leaving. Margaret stroked his arm. "I'm proud of you." John let out a heavy breath. This was only the beginning of a battle he hadn't been prepared for, but if there was one thing he knew, it was that he couldn't afford to give up. Not now. Not ever. The night dragged on, filled with restless sleep and strange dreams. In his mind, John was back at home, sitting at the dinner table with his family. Emily was laughing at something he had said, and Margaret's hand was warm in his. It was a comforting dream, a reminder of what he was fighting for. But then the scene shifted, his coffee cup slipped from his grasp, his vision blurred, and suddenly he was back in the hospital bed, trapped in a body that refused to obey. Him! He jolted awake, his breathing uneven. Margaret stirred beside him. "John, are you okay?" He wanted to say yes, but all he could manage was a small grunt. His frustration grew. How was he supposed to communicate if his own body refused to cooperate? Margaret rubbed his hand gently. "It's all right, love. You're safe." Safe. The word felt foreign. He didn't feel safe, he felt trapped. Morning came, and with it another wave of tests. More doctors, more questions. A physical therapist arrived this time, a sturdy man named Robert, who spoke with a reassuring calmness. "All right, Mr. Carter, let's see what we're working with." He adjusted the bed so John was in a sitting position. "Try lifting your right arm for me." John focused all his energy on the task, willing his arm to rise. It moved, barely, just a small twitch. It wasn't much, but it was something. Robert nodded. "That's good. That's a start." John let out a shaky breath. He had never felt so drained from such a small movement. "This is going to be tough," Robert admitted, "but you strike me as the kind of man who doesn't back down from a challenge." Margaret smiled. "You've got that right." John appreciated their optimism, but he wasn't sure he shared it. This wasn't just a challenge, it was an entirely new way of living, one he wasn't prepared for. As the day went on, he was met with more therapy sessions, more attempts to speak, to move, to regain what had been taken from him. It was exhausting. Every failure gnawed at him, but he reminded himself of one thing: giving up wasn't an option. By the time the sun began to set, he felt utterly spent. Margaret helped adjust his pillows, brushing his thinning hair back from his forehead. "You did good today, John." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that tomorrow would be easier, but deep down he knew the road ahead was long, and for the first time in his life he wasn't sure if he had the strength to walk it. The harsh reality of recovery. John Carter had always believed that strength came from within. His entire life, he had prided himself on being a man of resilience, a husband who provided for his family, a professor who pushed through long hours of research, and a father who had never let his loved ones see him struggle. But as he sat in his hospital bed, staring down at a body that no longer obeyed him, he felt something foreign creeping in: helplessness. It had been 3 days since the stroke. The clot-busting drug, TPA, had worked, but the damage had been done. His right side remained sluggish, his speech a shadow of what it once was. He could barely form a full sentence without slurring, and the simplest movements, grasping a spoon, lifting his arm, attempting to stand, felt like monumental tasks. Margaret was there, as she always was. She had barely left his side, her presence a steady anchor in an otherwise turbulent storm. "You need to eat, John," she said gently, bringing a spoonful of soup to his lips. John frowned. Eating had never been something he thought about before. His hands simply did what they were supposed to. But now, as he tried to hold the spoon himself, his fingers trembled. The utensil slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the tray. His frustration bubbled up, and he let out a groan of irritation. "It's okay," Margaret soothed, quickly retrieving the spoon. "It's going to take time." Time. That word had never felt so heavy before. A knock at the door broke the silence, and a young woman stepped inside. She was petite, with kind eyes and a determined expression. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. I'm Rachel, your occupational therapist." She pulled a chair up beside his bed, glancing between John and Margaret. "We're going to start working on getting some movement back today." John sighed. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to face the reality of his condition, let alone start fighting against it. Rachel, sensing his hesitation, offered him a reassuring smile. "I know this is overwhelming, but the sooner we start, the better your chances of regaining function." Margaret nodded encouragingly. "You can do this, John. John wasn't so sure, but he gave a small nod nonetheless. Rachel began with simple exercises. "Try to wiggle your fingers," she instructed. John concentrated, staring at his hand as if sheer willpower could force his fingers to move. A slight twitch, barely noticeable. His breath caught in his throat. "That's good," Rachel said. Immediately. "That's a start." John exhaled sharply. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt pathetic. "We're going to keep working on this," Rachel continued. "Your brain is capable of rewiring itself. It's called neuroplasticity. With enough repetition, your body can relearn what it's lost." John glanced at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. He wanted to believe it was possible, but at that moment all he felt was exhaustion. The next morning, a physical therapist named Robert arrived. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding but not intimidating. "All right, Mr. Carter," Robert said, adjusting the hospital bed. "We're going to try standing today." John's stomach twisted. Standing. Something so simple, so automatic. But as Robert swung John's legs over the side of the bed, he felt how foreign it was. His right leg barely responded, his balance completely off. "I've got you," Robert reassured, gripping John's waist firmly. "On the count of 3, we're going to push up. Ready?" John took a shaky breath. "Ready. 1, 2, 3. He pushed with all his might, but his right leg refused to bear weight. His knees buckled, and if not for Robert's strong grip, he would have collapsed. "Damn it!" John spat, his voice hoarse with frustration. "It's okay," Robert said firmly. "This is part of the process. Your muscles are weak, but we'll build them back up." John clenched his fists. He hated this, hated feeling like a burden. But then he caught sight of Margaret. She was watching him with nothing but unwavering faith in her eyes. She wasn't disappointed. She wasn't frustrated. She just believed in him. And suddenly, John realized that he needed to believe in himself too. Over the next few days, therapy became his new routine. Every morning, Rachel worked on his fine motor skills, trying to get him to grasp small objects, practicing writing, attempting to hold a cup without spilling. It was exhausting, humiliating even, but with each passing day there was progress, however small. In the afternoons, Robert pushed him harder. "All right, Carter," he said one afternoon, wheeling John down to the therapy gym. "Today, we try the parallel bars." John eyed the metal bars warily. They stretched in front of him like an obstacle course, daring him to take the first step. "I'm not sure I can do this," he admitted. "Maybe not today," Robert said. "But we try." With Robert supporting him on one side and Margaret watching from nearby, John gritted his teeth and gripped the bars tightly. His right foot dragged as he attempted to move forward, but after several tries, he managed a single step. Margaret clapped. "That's it, John." John exhaled, his arms trembling from the effort. One step, just one. But for the first time, it felt like hope. That night, as John lay in bed, exhausted but awake, he thought about the road ahead. Recovery wasn't going to be fast. It wasn't going to be easy. But today, he had taken a step. Tomorrow, he would take another. A man's will is tested. John Carter had always prided himself on being a man of determination. He had built a career through perseverance, raised a family through hard work, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had never been defeated. But now, as he sat in his wheelchair, staring at the therapy gym ahead of him, he felt like he was standing at the base of an impossible mountain. It had been a week since he had been moved to the rehabilitation center, and though he had made small progress, it didn't feel like enough. His right hand still refused to obey him. His speech had improved slightly, but the slurred words frustrated him more than he cared to admit. And walking still felt like an unattainable goal. Margaret wheeled him into the gym, where Robert, his physical therapist, was already waiting. The room was filled with other stroke survivors, each at different stages of recovery. Some were walking hesitantly with canes, others were gripping the parallel bars, just as he had done days before. John knew he wasn't alone in this fight, but that didn't make it any easier. "Morning, Carter," Robert greeted with his usual enthusiasm. "Today's the day we push a little harder." John let out a slow breath. He knew what that meant. More attempts at standing, more struggling. To move his leg, more failure. But failure wasn't an option, not anymore. For the next hour, Robert guided him through exercises meant to wake up the muscles on his right side. They started small, ankle movements, weight shifts, knee lifts. Every movement felt like lifting a boulder, his own body fighting against him at every turn. John gritted his teeth as he tried to lift his leg. Nothing. It refused to obey. Frustration boiled in his chest. "Come on, John," Robert urged. "Your brain and muscles need to reconnect. Even if you don't feel it moving, your effort is working." John growled under his breath, attempting again. This time, his foot twitched slightly. "There!" Robert pointed. "Did you feel that?" John had barely noticed, but Margaret clapped excitedly from the side. "You did it, John!" he exhaled sharply. A twitch. That was all. It felt like nothing, and yet they were celebrating. He hated this. Hated feeling like a child relearning how to move. Robert, noticing John's expression, crouched beside him. "You're frustrated." John let out a bitter chuckle. "That obvious?" Robert smiled. "Look, I get it. You were independent your whole life. This feels like being trapped in your own body." John looked away. That was exactly how he felt. "But let me ask you something," Robert continued. "What's the alternative? Give up? Accept that you won't walk again?" John's jaw tightened. "No." "Good," Robert said firmly, "because I've seen people in worse condition than you walk again. But the ones who do, they never stop fighting." John inhaled deeply. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe this wasn't about how far he had to go, but how willing he was to take the next step, no matter how small. That afternoon, Margaret brought their grandson, Ethan, to visit. The 8-year-old bounded into the room, his eyes lighting up when he saw John. "Grandpa!" Ethan rushed to his side. "Mum said you're getting stronger." John forced a smile. He didn't feel stronger, but he wouldn't disappoint Ethan. "I'm trying, kiddo." Ethan grinned, then climbed onto the chair beside John. "When can we go on our walks again?" John's throat tightened. That question cut deeper than anything. Those walks had been their tradition, their special time together. "I don't know, buddy," John admitted, "but I'm working on it." Ethan thought for a moment, then hopped down. "Wait here." He dashed out of the room, returning moments later with a small soccer ball. "Mum said I should practice kicking. Want to practice with me?" John hesitated. He looked down at his right leg, the leg that had refused to move all day. Margaret squeezed his hand. "Try, John." He took a shaky breath, nodding. Robert had told him earlier that even the effort counted. Maybe it was time to believe it. Ethan placed the ball in front of John's foot. "Just tap it, Grandpa." John focused all his energy on his leg, willing it to move. At first, nothing. Then, ever so slightly, his foot twitched against the ball. It rolled just an inch. But Ethan gasped, as if John had just scored the winning goal. "You did it!" Ethan cheered, running to retrieve the ball. "Let's do it again!" John felt something shift inside him. It was just a tap, just an inch. But to Ethan, it was everything. And for the first time since the stroke, John allowed himself to feel proud. That night, as Margaret helped him into bed, John spoke softly. "I almost gave up today." Margaret turned to him, brushing a hand through his graying hair. "But you didn't." John stared at the ceiling. "I don't know if I can do this, Maggie." She cupped his face, her eyes filled with the same determination he used to have. "You can, and you will." John exhaled. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that tomorrow he'd be stronger, that the next step would come easier. As he drifted into sleep, the last thing he thought about was Ethan's laughter. The way he had cheered when the ball moved. Maybe that was enough to keep him going. for now at least. Small victories, great triumphs. The days blurred together in the rehabilitation center. Every morning, John Carter woke up to the sterile white walls, the distant hum of hospital equipment, and the quiet shuffle of nurses moving through the halls. It wasn't home, but for now it was his battleground. He had come to understand something about recovery. It wasn't linear. Some days he felt strong, determined, like he was reclaiming his body. Other days, frustration consumed him, making him want to rip out the IVs and give up altogether. But the thought of Margaret, of Ethan, of his old life, kept him going. The first real breakthrough on the 12th day of therapy, John sat in his wheelchair in front of the parallel bars, his hands gripping the cool metal tightly. His therapist, Robert, stood beside him, offering quiet encouragement. "All right, Carter, we're going to try something new today. You're going to take a step." John swallowed hard. He had tried before. He had tried and failed. His right leg was still sluggish, still unreliable. He had come to expect disappointment. Robert seemed to read his mind. "This time, we're using a new approach. I want you to focus on shifting. Your weight first. Don't think about stepping yet. Just shift your body forward like you would naturally before a step." John hesitated, then nodded. With great effort, he shifted slightly forward, his left leg bearing most of the weight. His right leg remained still. "Good," Robert said. "Now, focus on your right leg. Even the smallest movement is progress." John inhaled deeply, willing his leg to move. He could feel the energy building, his muscles straining against the stillness, and then, miraculously, his foot lifted. Barely an inch, but it lifted. Margaret, who had been watching from the side, gasped. "John!" John's own eyes widened. "Did you see that?" Robert grinned. "I saw it, and now we do it again." It took another 15 minutes, but by the time the session ended, John had managed to take half a step. It was wobbly, slow, and exhausting, but it was his. That night, Margaret sat beside him, holding his hand. "I knew you'd do it." John sighed. "It was barely a step." Margaret smiled. "It was your step." For the first time since the stroke, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could walk again. The challenge of speech. The next battle was speech. His therapist, Emily, was patient, kind, and relentless. "Your brain still knows the words, John," she explained. "We just need to help it reconnect." They started with simple sounds, repeating vowel sounds, forming single-syllable words. "Say cat," Emily instructed, showing him a picture. John opened his mouth. "See, ka, almost there." He gritted his teeth. He knew the word. It was in his mind, but his mouth refused to cooperate. Margaret leaned forward. "Take your time, love." John tried again. Cat. Emily beamed. "Yes, that's it." Margaret wiped a tear from her eye. "I knew you could do it." John exhaled sharply. It was one word, but it felt like conquering a mountain. Every day he practiced. He read aloud, even if the words came out garbled. He listened to music, humming along, retraining his brain. And then, one evening, as Margaret tucked him into bed, he whispered, "Love you." She froze. Tears welled in her eyes. It was the first full phrase he had spoken clearly since the stroke. She kissed his forehead. "I love you too, John." That night, he slept better than he had in weeks. Moments of doubt, but not every day was victorious. There were days when his body refused to cooperate, when exhaustion weighed him down, when he felt like a burden. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult therapy session, he slumped in his wheelchair, shaking his head. "I can't do this." Margaret knelt beside him. "Yes, you can." He looked at her, frustration burning in his chest. "You don't understand, Maggie. I feel trapped. I try and I get nowhere." She took his hand. You've come farther than you realize, John. Think back to that first day in the hospital. You couldn't move your leg at all. Now, you've taken a step. You couldn't speak, and now you're forming words." He exhaled shakily. "It's not enough." Margaret cupped his face. "It's more than enough, and tomorrow you'll do more." John didn't respond, but deep down he knew she was right. A new source of motivation. The next day, Ethan visited again. The boy ran into the room, beaming. "Grandpa, I made you something." He handed John a small, hand-drawn picture. It showed the two of them walking in the park. John looked strong, standing tall. "That's us, Grandpa," Ethan said proudly. "Mom says you'll be walking again soon." John stared at the picture. His throat tightened. He looked at Robert. "I want to try again." Robert grinned. "That's what I like to hear." With Margaret and Ethan watching, John gripped the parallel bars. He shifted his weight forward, focused on his right leg. He tried, and this time the movement felt just a little bit easier. He took a step, then another. Margaret clapped. Ethan cheered. John exhaled, gripping the bars tightly. His legs burned, his body ached. But in that moment he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. And for now, that was enough. Facing setbacks with grit. Progress, as John Carter quickly learned, was not a straight road. It was a winding path filled with highs and lows, triumphs and setbacks. And no matter how determined he was, some days felt like nothing but failure. It had been nearly a month since his stroke. He had taken steps, spoken words, regained small victories. But then came the bad days, the days where exhaustion overtook him, where his leg refused to move, where his speech became muddled again. And with those bad days came something worse than weakness. Doubt. A sudden setback. It happened on a Tuesday morning during a routine therapy session. John had just begun walking short distances with a cane, his confidence growing, his body remembering the rhythm of movement. But as he took a step forward, a sudden wave of dizziness hit him. His vision blurred, the room spinning. His grip on the cane loosened, and before he could catch himself, his right leg buckled. He fell hard onto the padded floor, his body crashing down with a force that sent a jolt of pain through his hip. "John!" Margaret cried, rushing toward him. Robert, his physical therapist, was at his side in an instant. "Stay still, Carter. Tell me what you're feeling." John clenched his jaw. He hated this, hated being on the floor, being treated like a fragile old man. "I'm fine," he muttered, though the spinning in his head suggested otherwise. Robert didn't look convinced. "We're going to check your vitals. I need to make sure this wasn't another stroke." Margaret's face paled. Another stroke? John felt his chest tighten. He hadn't considered that possibility. The next hour was a blur of tests. Blood. Pressure readings, neurological checks, urgent conversations between doctors. When they finally ruled out another stroke, the relief in Margaret's eyes was unmistakable. It was just a dip in blood pressure, the doctor explained. That, combined with fatigue, likely caused the fall. But it's a reminder that recovery isn't just about getting stronger, it's about pacing yourself. John grunted. "I don't have time to slow down." The doctor gave him a patient look. "Mr. Carter, if you push too hard, you risk another stroke, and that would be a much bigger setback than a fall." John knew the doctor was right, but knowing and accepting were two different things. Doubts and darkness. That night, as Margaret helped him into bed, he stared at the ceiling, frustration burning inside him. "I should be doing better than this." Margaret sighed, settling beside him. "John, you're doing better." He shook his head. "One minute I'm walking, the next I'm on the floor like some helpless old man." "You are not helpless," she said firmly. John exhaled, running a hand over his face. "It doesn't feel that way." Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she reached for his hand. "Do you remember when you taught Emily how to ride a bike?" John frowned. "Of course." She fell the first time, and the second, and the third. Margaret smiled faintly. And you told her that falling wasn't failure, that as long as she got back up, she was learning. John's chest tightened. He had said those words, and now they had come back to him in a way he had never expected. "You're learning too, John," Margaret whispered. "And you are not failing." He didn't respond right away, but as he drifted into sleep, her words stayed with him. A new plan. The next morning, John met with Robert again. "I need a new strategy," he admitted, "one that doesn't land me on the floor." Robert smirked. "Glad to hear it." They adjusted his therapy routine, more seated balance work, strength training for his weaker side, controlled walking with closer supervision. It was slower, more methodical, but it gave John a sense of control over his progress. And then something changed. The frustration lessened, the doubt faded. Because he realized something. Margaret was right. He wasn't failing. He was learning. Pushing forward. A week later, John stood at the therapy bars once more. His grip was steady, his breathing calm. Margaret and Ethan watched from nearby, hopeful but cautious. "All right, Carter," Robert said. "Let's take a step." John exhaled, shifted his weight and moved forward. One step, then another. His leg still dragged slightly, but this time it didn't betray him. Margaret clapped. Ethan beamed. John let out a slow breath. He wasn't where he wanted to be yet. But for the first time since his stroke, he believed, truly believed, that he would get there, one step at a time. The power of purpose. John Carter sat by the window of the rehabilitation center, watching the autumn leaves swirl outside. It had been weeks since the stroke, and though he had made progress, he still wasn't where he wanted to be. His leg remained stiff, his speech still slow, but something had changed. The frustration was still there, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it had been replaced by something else, determination. That morning, Robert had told him something that stuck with him. "You've reached a turning point, Carter. Recovery isn't just about regaining movement. It's about finding purpose again." John had thought about those words all day. Purpose. What was his purpose now? Before the stroke, he had known exactly who he was. A history professor, a father, a grandfather, a man who enjoyed long walks and lively debates over coffee. But who was he now? He exhaled, gripping the arms of his wheelchair. He wasn't going to find his purpose sitting around feeling sorry for himself. He had work to do. A new routine. John had never been one for idleness, and he wasn't about to start now. So he created a schedule. Every morning he woke up at the same time, washed up, and did his stretching exercises before therapy began. In the afternoons he practiced his speech, reading aloud from a book Margaret had brought him. And in the evenings he walked, just a few steps at a time, but each one counted. Robert noticed the change immediately. "You're pushing yourself harder," he observed as John worked on his balance exercises. John nodded. "I need to." Robert crossed his arms. "Why?" John thought for a moment before answering. "Because I need to feel like myself again." Robert smiled. "Good answer." Helping others won. Afternoon, John sat in the common area of the rehab center, sipping his tea. Across from him sat a man in his 50s, his left arm hanging limp by his side. He had arrived at the center a few days earlier and hadn't spoken much since. John recognized that look, the same frustration, the same fear. He knew it well. "You're new here," John said, his words still slow but clear enough. The man looked up, surprised. "Yeah," he muttered. "Name's David." "John Carter," he replied, extending his left hand. David hesitated before shaking it. You had a stroke too?" John nodded. "A bad one. Thought I'd never walk again." David exhaled, rubbing his face. "That's what I'm afraid of." John studied him for a moment before leaning forward. "First week is the hardest. You feel like your body betrayed you, like you'll never get back to where you were." David nodded silently. But you will, John continued. One step at a time. David let out a humorless laugh. That's easy for you to say, John tapped his cane. You think so? David's eyes widened as realization hit. I was where you are, John said. Scared, angry, but you've got a choice. You can let this break you or you can fight. David was quiet for a long time before finally nodding. How do you do it? John smiled faintly. One step at a time, sharing his story. The next day, John mentioned David to Margaret. I think he needed to hear it from someone who's been through it. Margaret smiled. You're good at that, you know. John raised a brow. At what? Inspiring people, she said simply. John let that sit for a moment. He had never thought of himself that way. He had spent his life teaching history. But maybe, just maybe, he had another lesson to share. Later that evening, he asked one of the nurses if he could speak to a group of stroke patients. The next day, she arranged it. As he sat before a small group of fellow survivors, John felt a familiar feeling, one he had almost forgotten, the thrill of teaching. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, he began. This is the hardest thing you'll ever do. There will be days when you want to quit, days when you feel like you're not making progress. Heads nodded. They understood. But here's the thing, every step, every word, every small victory matters. I know, because I've been there. He told them about his first attempts to move his fingers, his struggles with speech, his fall in therapy. And then he told them about the steps, the words, the victories. You are more than your stroke, he said, his voice steady. You are your will to keep going. When he finished, there was silence. Then, slowly, they began to clap. Margaret watched from the back of the room, pride shining in her eyes. John exhaled. He had found his purpose again, and it felt damn good. Giving back to the community. John Carter had spent most of his life as a teacher, but after his stroke, he never expected to find himself in that role again. And yet, as he sat in the rehabilitation center's gathering room, speaking to a small group of stroke survivors and their families, he realized that teaching had never left him. It had simply taken on a new form. The past weeks had been filled with struggle, progress, setbacks, and breakthroughs. But now, something new stirred inside him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He had found a purpose in helping others. Building a support group. The day after his first talk, a nurse approached him. John, there's been a lot of interest from patients wanting to hear more from you. Would you be open to holding regular sessions? John hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Of course. Margaret beamed with pride when he told her that evening. I knew you'd find a way to turn this into something bigger. So twice a week he began hosting small meetings for stroke survivors at the rehab center. At first, it was just a handful of patients, people like David, who was still struggling to accept his condition. But word spread and soon more patients started attending. John didn't lecture or preach. He shared his story, listened to theirs, and encouraged them to share their own victories, no matter how small. One patient celebrated being able to lift a spoon again. Another managed to say their spouse's name for the first time in months. Each victory mattered. One afternoon, a woman named Linda approached him after a meeting. Her husband, a stroke survivor, sat quietly beside her, his hands clenched in his lap. Mr. Carter, she began, my husband, Tom. He hasn't spoken much since the stroke, but after your meeting today, he whispered his first words. John turned to Tom, who met his gaze for the first time. Thank you, Tom said, his voice weak but determined. John swallowed the lump in his throat. You're welcome, Tom. Keep going, one step at a time. Reaching beyond the rehab center. As the weeks passed, John realized that the support group was making a real difference. But he wanted to do more. He wanted to reach beyond the rehab center, to help stroke survivors who didn't have access to resources or a support system. One evening, he turned to Margaret. "I want to start something bigger." Margaret set down her book. "What do you mean?" "I want to create an online support group, a space where stroke survivors and their families can connect, share advice, and encourage each other." Margaret's eyes lit up. "That's a wonderful idea, John." With Emily's help, John set up a private online group. He shared his story in a welcome post and invited others to do the same. Within days, dozens of stroke survivors and caregivers joined. They shared their fears, their triumphs, their struggles. They encouraged each other on bad days and celebrated every small success. John found himself responding to messages daily, offering words of encouragement, sharing exercises he had learned, and reminding them all, "You are not alone." One evening, he received a message from a man in another state. "I was ready to give up until I found this group. Thank you for giving me hope." John wiped a tear from his eye. This was bigger than him now. And that thought filled him with a deep sense of fulfillment, advocating for stroke awareness. As John's physical therapy continued, he gained more mobility. His speech improved, his strength returned, and with it, his drive to make a difference grew stronger. One day, a representative from a local health organization visited the rehab center to speak about stroke awareness. After the session, Margaret nudged John. "You should talk to them. You have a story worth sharing." So he did. John introduced himself, shared his journey, and explained his passion for helping stroke survivors. The representative listened intently. "John, have you ever thought about speaking at awareness events?" John blinked. "Me? People need to hear real stories," she said. "Stories like yours can inspire early recognition of stroke, symptoms, and encourage others to seek treatment sooner." That night, John lay awake thinking he had spent his life teaching history. But maybe his greatest lesson wasn't about the past. It was about survival, resilience, and hope. 2 weeks later, he stood before a crowd at a community health seminar, microphone in hand. Margaret and Ethan sat in the front row, watching him proudly. He took a deep breath. "A year ago, I didn't know if I'd ever walk or speak properly again. I didn't know if I'd ever feel like myself, but I stand here today because I refuse to give up. And if you take anything from my story, let it be this: you are stronger than you think, and you are never alone." The audience erupted into applause. And for the first time in a long time, John felt truly whole again. He had turned his struggle into strength, and in doing so, he had given others the courage to do the same. A new chapter, a new man. The crisp autumn air filled John Carter's lungs as he stood outside on the walking path of his neighborhood park. He tightened his grip on his cane, taking in the golden hues of the leaves as they drifted to the ground. It had been a long road to this moment, a year of pain, perseverance, and rediscovery. But now, as he stood tall, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: freedom. Margaret stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice full of warmth. John exhaled slowly. "I've been waiting for this." He took a step forward, then another. The cane was still there, his balance still wobbly at times, but he was walking, not in a therapy room, not with a physical therapist guiding him, but outside, under the open sky where he belonged. Ethan, his grandson, ran ahead and turned back with an eager grin. "Come on, Grandpa, let's go to the bench like we used to," John chuckled. A year ago, he had doubted he'd ever be able to do something as simple as this. Now, he was proving himself wrong. Looking back. It had been a year since the stroke, a year that had tested him in ways he never imagined. There were days when he wanted to quit, days when he questioned whether all the effort was worth it, but every time he thought about stopping, he remembered why he started. Margaret had been his rock. She had believed in him even when he had doubted himself. Ethan had been his light, reminding him of the simple joys he still had to experience. And the people he had met along the way, the stroke survivors in his support group, the online community he had built, the individuals he had spoken to at awareness events, they had become part of his journey. He had gone from feeling like a victim to becoming a mentor, an advocate, a voice of encouragement for those still in the fight. And now, it was time for the next chapter. The graduation. 2 weeks earlier, John had completed his final session at the rehabilitation center. The staff had gathered to celebrate his progress, presenting him with a certificate of completion, a symbolic moment, but one that held great meaning. "You're not just leaving therapy, John," Robert had told him. "You're stepping into a new life." John had nodded, knowing the truth in those words. He wasn't the same man who had been wheeled into the emergency room a year ago. He was stronger, not just physically, but mentally. He had faced his greatest challenge and had come out the other side, not just surviving, but thriving, giving back. Since completing his therapy, John had committed himself fully to helping others. His online support group had grown, now reaching stroke survivors from across the country. Every day, people shared their progress, their frustrations, their victories. And John was there, offering encouragement, sharing advice, reminding them that they weren't alone. He had also continued speaking at events, partnering with health organizations to raise awareness about stroke prevention and recovery. His story was being used as an example in rehabilitation centers, proving that recovery wasn't just about physical therapy, it was about mindset, resilience, and community. One afternoon, he received an email from a young woman whose father had recently suffered a stroke. "Mr. Carter, I just wanted to thank you. My dad was feeling hopeless, convinced he'd never be himself again. Then I showed him one of your talks. He saw your progress, heard your story, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. He asked me to help him start therapy again. Thank you for giving him hope." John leaned back in his chair, the weight of the words settling in. He had spent months believing his stroke had taken everything from him. But now, he realized, it had given him a new purpose. Full circle. As John and Margaret reached the park bench, Ethan clambered up, patting the empty space beside him. "Sit next to me, Grandpa." John lowered himself onto the bench, sighing contentedly as he stretched his legs out. He looked around, taking in the familiar surroundings, the same park where he had walked so many mornings before his stroke, but now everything felt different. Margaret squeezed his hand. "You did it, John." He turned to her, smiling. "We did it." Ethan kicked his legs excitedly. "So, can we go on our walks every weekend again?" John chuckled. "I think that sounds like a great plan, kiddo." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, John realized something profound. His stroke had been a battle, the hardest one of his life, but it hadn't taken away who he was. It had transformed him, shaped him into someone stronger, someone who knew the value of every step, every word, every breath. And as he sat there, surrounded by the people he loved, he knew that this wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning of a new one. Final message to viewers. Recovery is not just about getting back to where you were. It's about discovering who you can become. No matter how hard the journey, no matter how many setbacks, you are not alone. Keep fighting, keep believing, and most importantly, keep moving forward, one step at a time. John Carter's journey reminds us that no matter how tough life gets, resilience and love can help us rise again. His story isn't just about survival. It's about finding new purpose, embracing each step forward, and proving that hope is never lost. But now, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this journey inspired you, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next powerful story. Don't forget to leave a like and share this video with someone who might need this message today. Thank you for watching, and remember, no matter what life throws your way, keep moving forward, one step at a time. See you in the next story.